In the heart of the unforgiving Rockies, one mountain man's cabin defied the bitter chill of winter. When the world was cloaked in ice and snow, his towering refuge became an unlikely sanctuary, built not just to survive, but to withstand nature's harshest freeze. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will reveal even more frontier ingenuity that changed the course of survival. The Rockies had seen winters before, but nothing like this. The year was 1839, and the air was thick with the weight of snow, the kind of snow that buried entire villages, froze rivers solid, and left no path for escape. For those brave enough to live among the towering peaks, survival meant more than enduring the cold. It meant mastering it. Samuel Hale, a seasoned mountain man, stood before his cabin, eyes tracing the roofline where the frost clung like an iron grip. His home was a fortress against the elements, a towering structure that had been built with more than just shelter in mind. The timber walls, layered with meticulous care, were designed to hold warmth, something no one in the region thought possible in such an unrelenting freeze. His cabin stood proud, a statement to both his ingenuity and his defiance against nature's bitter will. Each year, winter came earlier, harsher, and deeper into the heart of the Rockies. But Samuel had never been the kind of man to run from a challenge. His cabin was no ordinary structure. It was a triumph of careful planning, ruthless perseverance, and perhaps a little bit of obsession. Built high above the usual traps of wildlife and high enough to avoid floods, it was a beacon of hope in a frozen world. Samuel had spent years honing his skills, learning from every mistake and every man he encountered along the way. But his most recent innovation was born out of desperation. When the storm came earlier than expected, bringing with it a bitter cold no one was ready for, Samuel had already sealed his cabin for the season. He had thought ahead, constructing a roof that could handle the weight of both snow and time, and walls that could stand firm against the frozen winds. But the challenge was not just about keeping the cold out, it was about trapping the heat inside. His towering cabin had been built not just as a shelter, but as a safe haven from the frozen world outside. The fire crackled inside, warmth spilling from the chimney into the pale gray sky. As Samuel pulled the door shut behind him, he took one last look at the barren white landscape surrounding him. He had learned to trust this place, but he also knew the real test was yet to come. For in the mountains, nature never relented, and the freeze that no one had prepared for would soon prove whether Samuel's innovations would keep him safe or leave him to face the unforgiving elements alone. Inside the cabin, the warmth was almost too much to bear. Samuel had worked tirelessly to create a haven, a place where the fire wouldn't just provide temporary comfort, but would become part of the structure itself. The stone fireplace, nestled in the far corner of the room, was a masterpiece of design. Built to capture every bit of heat and radiate it throughout the cabin, it was unlike any other mountain fireplace. Samuel had borrowed ideas from the brick buildings he had seen in St. Louis, but had adapted them for his harsh environment. The walls were thick, made of logs that had been carefully selected for their straightness and uniformity. There were no weak spots, no gaps that could allow the cold to seep through. Samuel had painstakingly stripped the bark from each log, knowing that even the smallest imperfection could allow a draft. Between the logs, he had packed a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin, a compound he had spent weeks perfecting. It was strong enough to hold the walls firm, even in the harshest of winters, and flexible enough to adapt to the shifting temperature. But it wasn't just the logs that kept the cold at bay. Upstairs, Samuel's loft was a small but functional living space, complete with a wooden bed frame, hand-carved from the same timber that made the walls. A small window in the corner let in just enough light to warm the room during the day, and at night, The thick blankets kept him cozy. He had learned long ago that surviving the winters was a mental game, and having a comfortable place to rest was as important as any survival tactic. Beneath the loft, the rest of the cabin held what appeared to be the true genius of Samuel's design. Beneath his feet, the floor was unlike any other in a mountain cabin. Instead of simple wooden planks, Samuel had created a layer of insulation so dense that it trapped the heat rising from the fireplace below, redirecting it through hidden ducts built into the cabin's foundation. The cold was held at bay, not just by thick logs, but by a constant, gentle stream of warmth that seemed to flow through every part of the cabin. It was an unorthodox design, but Samuel had spent years refining it, and now, as the cold winds howled outside, it was paying off. The temperature inside was as comfortable as it would be in the summer months, and Samuel smiled as he sat down by the fire. He had done it. The cold would not win. His tower cabin, the creation of countless hours of trial and error, was proof that survival in the wilderness was not just about strength, but about adaptability, and that sometimes the most unlikely solutions were the ones that worked best. The wind howled louder than Samuel had ever heard it before. Outside, the storm raged with a fury that sent the snow into violent spirals, swirling in every direction. It was the kind of storm that seemed to make the earth itself tremble, a wild thing that defied human understanding. Samuel stood at the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he watched the blizzard batter his cabin's exterior. The storm had arrived quickly, and its strength was unlike anything he had ever prepared for. Inside, the fire crackled, a comforting contrast to the chaos outside. The warmth from the hearth filled the room, pooling into every corner. The cabin, designed with such meticulous care, had proven itself time and time again, but this storm was something else. He had built this place to withstand winter's worst, but nature had a way of pushing the limits of even the best-laid plans. Samuel had lived through blizzards before, but this was a monster. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was pushing, gnawing, clawing at the very foundation of his cabin. The snow fell in sheets, covering everything in its path. He could hear it scraping against the roof, settling into the eaves and corners like a living thing. It was the kind of cold that made bones ache and turned the skin to ice. Yet, inside the cabin, Samuel felt a strange sense of calm. The design had held. The warmth from the fire spread evenly throughout the cabin, its heat trapped inside by the thick, tightly fitted logs. The walls stood firm, unyielding to the pressure of the storm. The windows, small and reinforced, held their ground, and the door, his pride and joy, remained locked tight, just as it had been built to do. For a moment, Samuel allowed himself to relax. This was why he had built it, so that when the storm came, when the wilderness unleashed its fury, he would be safe. The cold and the wind could rage, but inside his fortress, he would survive. The storm had become a test, one he hadn't anticipated, but one he had prepared for nonetheless. But as the hours passed, the wind did not relent. The pressure from outside grew stronger. The snow piled higher against the walls, and the air seemed to grow colder. Samuel had no way of knowing just how long this storm would last, but his cabin was holding up. It was standing firm against nature's wrath, proving its worth in ways he hadn't expected. He would endure, just as the cabin would. The storm was no longer just a physical test. It was a test of Samuel's resolve. He took another sip from his mug, his eyes never leaving the swirling white chaos outside. The wilderness had tried to break him before. This time, he would be the one to endure. By the fourth day of the storm, Samuel began to notice something unsettling. Though the temperature inside his cabin remained steady, the isolation was starting to take its toll. The silence that filled the cabin, save for the crackling fire, grew heavier with each passing day. In the harshness of the storm, the world outside had been reduced to a blur of white, and Samuel's only company was the rhythmic hiss of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling under the weight of the snow. He had always known the mountains to be a place of solitude, but this winter, this storm, had stripped that solitude of its peace. It was no longer just a quiet retreat, it was a prison, and Samuel, despite the warmth and safety of his cabin, felt its walls closing in on him. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to anyone. His days of interaction had been limited to quick exchanges with passing trappers or solitary trips to town for supplies. But now there was no one. Only the storm and the cabin that had become both his refuge and his confinement. As he sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, Samuel's mind wandered back to the reason he had built the cabin in the first place. It had started as a way to protect himself from the wilds of the Rockies, to keep the cold at bay, to survive the dangers that lurked in every shadow. But now it had become something more, a fortress that separated him not just from the elements, but from the world itself. There were moments like this one when he questioned whether the price of survival was worth it. The long hours spent alone, the painstaking effort of building and reinforcing his home had brought him security, but it had also brought a heavy burden. There was a cost to his obsession, and Samuel couldn't deny it any longer. He had built the cabin to withstand the worst winter could throw at him. Yet in doing so, he had isolated himself from the people he used to call neighbors. The laughter of friends, the warmth of a shared meal, the connection of knowing others were out there, these things had become distant memories. Samuel hadn't fully realized how much he had sacrificed until now, when he sat in the stillness of his cabin and felt the weight of his solitude. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, and Samuel couldn't help but wonder, had the cost of surviving the wilds become too high? He had built something to endure the cold, but now he was left to face something far more insidious, the coldness of being alone. The storm outside raged on, but inside Samuel's cabin felt like the only place left in the world. And yet, for all the protection it offered, there was something about its walls that made the isolation feel even more profound. It was a paradox that Samuel didn't fully understand. Perhaps in the end, survival wasn't just about outlasting the storm. It was about finding a way to live through it, both physically and mentally. And that was a struggle he had yet to conquer. The storm had finally passed, but the silence that followed felt even more ominous. The skies were clear, the sun shining weakly through the fading remnants of the storm clouds. Samuel stood at the door of his cabin, looking out over the snow-covered landscape, his breath rising in puffs of steam as he surveyed the aftermath of the storm. The world seemed untouched, as if the wilderness had briefly given way to something gentler, only to return to its brutal nature as soon as the storm passed. Yet something felt wrong. The air was too still, the kind of stillness that told Samuel the mountain wasn't done with him yet. He turned toward the woods, his eyes scanning the distant tree line where the thick forest met the edge of the mountain. He had heard something earlier, a soft crunch of snow beneath heavy paws. It was faint, but unmistakable. Samuel's hand instinctively went to the rifle by the door, his fingers brushing the worn wood of the stock. He'd been alone in these mountains for years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something was out there. The first signs came hours later. Tracks, large clawed footprints in the fresh snow. A trail that wound its way toward his cabin, stopping just at the edge of his porch, the unmistakable signs of a grizzly bear. Samuel's stomach tightened, his mind racing through the possibilities. The bear had been here before, circling his cabin, testing the strength of the walls. But now it seemed the animal had grown more determined, more familiar. He inspected the tracks carefully, noting the way the bear had circled the cabin, the claw marks near the door. The creature had been toying with him, testing the cabin's defenses. Samuel knew this bear. It had been around for weeks, each time returning with more certainty, more cunning. It was no longer a random visitor, it was becoming an adversary, one that was learning. As evening set in, the temperature dropping once again, Samuel found himself by the fire, his rifle at his side. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He moved cautiously, checking every window and door, ensuring everything was secure. The bear was out there, somewhere, watching. It was not just the wilderness that tested Samuel's will to survive, but the creatures that roamed it, driven by hunger, instinct, and the same cold that he battled each day. Suddenly, he heard it again, the sound of something heavy moving in the snow. The bear was close. Samuel's heart pounded as he readied his rifle. The shadows in the snow grew long, stretching across the ground like a predator's reach. He waited, listening, praying that the thick walls of his cabin would hold firm once more. But he knew this time would be different. The bear was no longer a nuisance. It was a threat, one that would not leave until it had what it wanted. Night fell quickly, and the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. Samuel sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the shadows outside. The storm had passed, but the tension was still thick in the air. The bear was out there, and Samuel had no illusions that it was anything less than a threat. It had come too close, too many times. The calm of the day had been a false sense of security. The fire flickered, casting long shadows against the walls of the cabin. Samuel checked the door and windows once more, ensuring everything was locked, everything was secure. His mind kept returning to the same thought. The bear had already circled the cabin. What if it decided to make an attempt tonight? What if the defenses he had so carefully built weren't enough? He could hear it now, the soft crunch of snow beneath heavy paws, the subtle shift of weight as the animal moved closer. Samuel's heart raced as his fingers tightened around the rifle's stock. He hadn't expected this. He had built this cabin to withstand everything, the cold, the storm, and even a bear's might. But this was something else. The bear circled the cabin again, its presence more tangible now. Samuel's eyes darted to the window. He could just make out the massive shape in the darkness, the shadow of something large and powerful, moving with eerie patience. It was testing the door again, just as it had before. The claw marks were there, deep and unmistakable, etched into the wood. The creature was persistent, relentless, like the storm that had only just passed. And Samuel realized, with a sharp clarity, that this would be the real test. The fire crackled, the warmth of the flames in sharp contrast to the chill creeping from the windows. Samuel could feel the weight of the moment settling around him. The storm had tested his cabin, but the bear was testing his resolve. This was a battle of wills. He stood up slowly, moving toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The bear was close now, just a few feet away from the door. It pushed at the log walls, growling low and deep, its massive body pressing against the structure with undeniable force. Samuel could hear the wood groan, the cabin responding to the pressure. The walls held, but just barely. For a moment, Samuel considered his options. He could try to fire through the window, but the bear was too close. The shot might miss or provoke the animal further. He had no choice but to wait, to let the cabin do what it was designed to do: hold. Then, without warning, the bear reared up on its hind legs, pawing at the walls. Samuel's heart raced, and in that moment he knew the truth. It wasn't the walls alone that would save him. It was the patience to endure, the strength to outlast, and the resolve to never give in. As the bear tested the cabin one final time, Samuel braced himself for what came next. The bear would leave, it always did, and Samuel would survive. But the test of fire, of enduring this wild force of nature, had only just begun. Morning light spilled through the cracks in the cabin's tightly secured windows, casting long shadows across the room. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with the remnants of its fury. Samuel stood by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, his mind replaying the events of the night before. The bear had come so close, so relentless in its pursuit, testing every inch of the cabin's defenses. But in the end, it had left, just as it always did. And yet Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the bear's shadow lingered over him, its presence a constant reminder that no matter how well he had prepared, nature would always find a way to test him. As the warmth of the fire spread through the cabin, Samuel began to move around, his boots crunching on the thick floorboards as he went about his morning chores. The rhythm of his actions was steady, almost mechanical, yet there was an undercurrent of unease that he couldn't ignore. He had built this cabin to withstand anything the wilderness could throw at it, but he had also built it to escape the pain of the past, the memories of the people he had left behind. The faces of friends and loved ones long gone had faded with time, but they had never truly disappeared. The mountain man lifestyle had a way of making men forget the world they came from. Out here, in the wilderness, survival came first, and everything else fell away. But the longer Samuel stayed in his cabin, the more he realized that the cold wasn't the only thing he was trying to shut out. He had built this place not just to endure the physical challenges of the wilderness, but to bury the emotional scars left by a life long forgotten. He paused in front of the fireplace, the crackling fire casting an orange glow on his weathered face. The wood was burning steadily, sending smoke curling up through the chimney, rising into the blue sky outside. But the fire wasn't enough to warm the ache in his chest. He had chosen this life, this isolation, because it allowed him to forget. But now, as he stood here, alone in the stillness of the cabin, he realized that the past was never as easily left behind as he had hoped. The memories he had tried so hard to forget had followed him into the wilderness, just as the bear had. Samuel turned away from the fire, his eyes falling on the cabin's walls. Each log, each carefully placed beam, held a story, a testament to his hard work, his ingenuity. But behind them, behind every inch of the cabin's structure, was a story that he could never truly escape. The life he had left behind, the people he had lost, the love he had abandoned, it all lingered here, in the corners of this place, in the very air he breathed. He wasn't just surviving the wilderness, he was surviving himself. And the harder he fought to keep the past buried, the louder it seemed to echo through the walls of his fortress. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next, the monotony of survival settling into a rhythm. The snow outside was beginning to soften, the frost slowly retreating, as spring began its slow ascent into the mountains. Yet for Samuel, time seemed to stretch on, each minute dragging as he continued his battle against the elements and against himself. But the calm of the changing season did little to soothe the tension that had been building in the pit of his stomach. The bear's visits had grown more frequent, more desperate. It had circled his cabin night after night, testing its defenses, learning its weaknesses. Samuel knew the bear would return, and this time he was not sure his cabin would be enough to hold it off. He spent the days reinforcing every weak spot, tightening the windows, securing the door, and ensuring the firewood was stocked high for the cold nights ahead. His thoughts were consumed by the idea that something he couldn't control, was about to break. Whether it was the cabin, the bear, or himself, Samuel couldn't say. But the weight of impending danger pressed on him, each moment feeling like the calm before the storm. On the 8th night, as the wind howled once more and the cold seeped through the cracks in the wall walls, the bear came again. This time Samuel was ready. His rifle was loaded and resting against the wall, his eyes trained on the door, waiting for the first signs of movement. He heard it before he saw it, the soft crunch of snow under heavy paws, the slow, deliberate steps of the beast as it approached. But something was different this time. The bear wasn't just circling, it was attacking. With a growl that shook the walls, it hurled itself against the door, its massive weight slamming into the wood with terrifying force. Samuel's heart raced as the door groaned under the pressure. He could hear the bear's claws scratching against the logs, testing, pushing, forcing its way in. In that moment, the walls that had always stood firm suddenly seemed fragile. All the work, all the preparation, all the hours spent perfecting his fortress, they didn't seem to matter. The bear was not just testing his cabin, it was testing his will to survive. Samuel's fingers tightened around the rifle as the bear slammed into the door again, its growls reverberating through the cabin. He had prepared for this, hadn't he? He had built this place to withstand anything. But as the door cracked under the pressure, the reality set in. The wilderness had never been kind, but this moment, this breaking point, was something he hadn't prepared for. The fire, the warmth, the protection, it all seemed so distant now, replaced by the sheer force of nature outside. The walls that had held him safe for so long were no longer a refuge. The wilderness had come for him, and no amount of preparation, no walls or locks, could hold back the tide forever. In that moment, Samuel realized that survival wasn't just about building something that would last. It was about facing the inevitability that no matter how hard you fought, some things, like the wilderness, like life itself, were beyond your control. And so, with a final glance at the door, Samuel made his choice. He wasn't just going to survive the wilderness, he was going to face it head on. The bear's growl was like thunder as it slammed against the door again. The wood creaked and splintered under the force of the impact. Samuel's pulse raced as he moved quickly, checking the rifle one last time. His hands were steady, but his mind was anything but calm. This was the moment he had been preparing for. But now, in the face of true danger, all the years of isolation, all the work, and all the knowledge he had accumulated felt fragile. The bear wasn't just testing the cabin anymore, it was trying to break him. Samuel moved with purpose, his boots crunching the snow beneath him as he crossed the room. He didn't hesitate as he approached the door, his eyes scanning the log walls one last time for weaknesses. The bear had already pushed through the outer layers of the structure. The door was all that stood between it and him. The massive animal's claws scraped against the logs, trying to pry its way inside, its rage palpable. In the silence that followed the bear's latest strike, Samuel heard the unmistakable sound of cracking wood. The door was buckling under the relentless force. He had built it to withstand this very moment, but even the strongest defenses have their limits. The bear was closing in, and Samuel could feel it in his bones. If he didn't act now, his fortress would fall. He moved swiftly, positioning himself near the window on the opposite wall. He peered out through the narrow gap, his breath fogging up the glass. The world outside was dark, the snow falling in thick, blinding sheets. Through the haze he caught a glimpse of the bear, its massive form charging toward the cabin again, its eyes filled with an almost maddened hunger. This time, Samuel was ready. He had learned everything there was to know about this bear, the way it moved, the way it tested its prey. He wasn't just going to fire blindly into the night, he was going to outwit it, to give himself the edge that no amount of strength could match. The trap he had set was simple, but effective. The gun was loaded with a single shot, a shot that would decide it all. As the bear approached once again, its claws clanging against the doorframe, Samuel took a deep breath. He steadied his rifle and waited for the right moment. The bear was so close now, its hot breath fogging up the window. Samuel could hear the thudding of its powerful body as it collided with the logs. He raised his rifle, aiming at the weak spot where the door had cracked. Time seemed to slow. With a sharp breath, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out like a clap of thunder, louder than the storm itself. The cabin seemed to shake with the sound. The bear's body lurched back, its roar of pain echoing through the night. It staggered, swaying on its feet before collapsing in the snow, its massive form unmoving. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the creature fall. The wilderness had tested him, pushed him to his limits, and in that moment he realized he had passed the test. He had survived. The quiet that followed was almost unnerving. For hours, Samuel sat by the fire, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing. The storm had passed, the bear was gone, and the cabin still stood, strong and unwavering. He couldn't help but marvel at how everything he had built, every painstaking decision he had made, had led him to this moment. He had survived the wilderness, yes, but more than that, he had conquered it. The cabin was his legacy, not just a place of refuge, but a testament to his ability to adapt, to evolve, and to overcome the forces that sought to break him. The walls that had kept the storm out had also kept him grounded, kept him connected to the world that existed outside the harsh mountain ranges. The fire that burned now wasn't just a symbol of warmth. It was a beacon of hope, a light in the darkness. As the days passed, Samuel moved around the cabin with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The bear's attack was over, but the lessons he had learned weren't. The wilderness had a way of humbling you, of reminding you that survival wasn't just about strength or resilience. It was about learning from your struggles, about growing stronger with each battle. For Samuel, the winter had been a crucible. He had faced the elements, the wild animals, and his own fears. And through it all, his cabin had stood as a sanctuary, a fortress not just from the outside world, but from the parts of himself he had long buried. It had been more than a structure. It had been a mirror, reflecting back at him the cost of survival. Now, as the first signs of spring began to break through the snow, Samuel realized something else. The fight wasn't over. The wilderness would always be there, always testing, always challenging, but he had learned how to face it, how to survive it, and how to thrive in it. The legacy of his cabin would live on, passed down through the generations of trappers, settlers, and adventurers who would one day find it, hidden deep in the Rockies. And though Samuel would eventually leave these mountains, his mark on the land would remain, a reminder of the quiet strength it took to survive when the world was at its coldest. With the fire burning low and the mountains beyond calm once more, Samuel stepped outside into the cool morning air, breathing in the crisp scent of the wilderness. The world had been harsh, but in the end it was his. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel Hale felt at peace.